Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving deep into a listener-requested topic today, one that's really, tangled, to say the least. The Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And specifically, how this conflict gets tied up with U.S. Cold War policy, the whole idea of containment.
Right.
You guys sent in a ton of great stuff for this one. Articles, podcasts, even some seriously scholarly stuff.
Wow.
And I gotta say, prepping for this, even before we hit record, some of the details, just wild.
It's a period that's, it still gets people arguing, even after all these years.
Exactly. And that's what struck me, too, going through all this. There's no easy answer, no single thing that explains the Vietnam War.
Oh, absolutely not.
Like decisions, ideologies, global events, all tangled up in this massive knot. But maybe, I don't know, a good place to start is before the U.S. officially jumps into the war.
Okay.
Because I think a lot of folks might not realize the U.S. was already bankrolling a huge chunk of the French war effort in Vietnam, way before U.S. boots hit the ground.
It's true. And to get that, we got to rewind a bit, go back to the post-World War II world. You've got these anti-colonial movements popping up everywhere, and Vietnam's right there fighting like hell for independence from France, led by, of course, Ho Chi Minh.
And this is where it gets interesting, right? Because Ho Chi Minh, he actually asks the U.S. for help. What happens there?
So Ho Chi Minh, he saw the U.S. as, maybe a natural ally, a nation that had fought for its own independence. He appealed to that, their ideals, self-determination, all that. But there's a catch, a big one. His communist ideology.
Oh, boy. Yeah. That's got to be a deal breaker in the Cold War.
Absolutely. U.S. is already locked into this Cold War mindset. Communism is the enemy, the ultimate threat. So they basically make a choice. They turn down Ho Chi Minh's request and instead decide to back France.
So siding with the colonial power against a movement for independence.
Yeah.
That seems, I don't know, kind of goes against the whole land of the free thing, doesn't it?
It really highlights just how complicated, how contradictory the Cold War was. By 1954, the U.S. was paying for, get this, 80%, a full 80% of the French war effort.
80%. That's not just like sending a care package. That's a serious commitment.
It was. And then come the Geneva Accords, 1954, meant to, temporarily divide Vietnam, set up elections for 56, reunification, the whole 9 yards. And here's where it gets really head-scratchy. The U.S., they refused to sign these accords.
Why? If the goal was peace, that seems like the logical step, right?
See, the U.S. was deeply suspicious, to put it mildly. They figured, and probably not without reason, that Ho Chi Minh, super popular guy, he was going to win those elections, which meant a unified communist Vietnam.
So they'd rather fund a war than risk an election.
That's essentially what it boils down to. There's a historian, Walter Lefebvre, he argues that this refusal, this was a turning point, maybe the turning point. He suggests that intentionally or not, the U.S. slams the door on a chance for a peaceful, everybody gets along Vietnam.
It really makes you think, what if they'd played ball, engaged with the process?
Instead, they double down, hard. Containment becomes the name of the game. And to make sure communism doesn't spread in Southeast Asia, the U.S. creates SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, same year, 1954.
SEATO. Now, for folks who aren't history buffs like us, what exactly is that?
So think of it like NATO, but for Asia. A bunch of countries, U.S., France, U.K., Australia, New Zealand, a bunch of others. The whole point, stop communism from spreading any further, though gotta say, it never quite had the same, the same teeth as NATO did.
Interesting. Sounds like even back then, the groundwork was being laid for something much bigger.
Yeah, and this leads us right into, Kennedy and Johnson, where Vietnam, it really becomes the center of U.S. foreign policy.
It's like you can almost feel it, right? This sense of, inevitability, even if nobody knows how bad it's going to get.
Yeah, and it really kicks into gear with Kennedy and Johnson. Both of them, they see South Vietnam as like the Alamo, the line in the sand. If that falls, communism just, boom, takes over Southeast Asia, dominoes, the whole deal.
So they're all in on propping up South Vietnam, whatever it takes. What does that actually look like, though?
Well, Kennedy, early 60s, he ramps up the U.S. military advisors in Vietnam. They're there to back up Ngo Dinh Diem, the leader of South Vietnam. Problem is, Diem's regime, it was, corrupt, and definitely not winning any popularity contests with the Vietnamese people.
So backing a guy who, his own people don't even like, sounds like a recipe for trouble.
Exactly. It actually makes the whole thing worse, fuels the resistance. See, Diem, he's not exactly subtle, cracks down hard, persecutes Buddhists, the whole bit. And that just pushes more people towards the Viet Cong, the communist insurgency in the South.
Adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly. Then 1963, Kennedy's assassinated. Lyndon Johnson, he inherits this whole mess. Does Johnson change course at all?
Well, not really.
He feels this huge weight, this responsibility to keep America's word, to
Yeah.
be in Vietnam. And then August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Everything changes.
That's the one where, North Vietnamese boats attack U.S. destroyers?
Yeah. Supposedly. Thing is, even now, historians still argue about what really went down in the Gulf of Tonkin. Some say the second attack, the one everyone freaked out about, might not have even happened.
Wait, so the thing that basically gets the U.S. stuck in Vietnam could have been, what, a mistake? Bad intel?
It's one of the big what-ifs of the whole war. But at the time, the Johnson administration, they used this incident, push through the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution.
And that's a big deal because...
It basically gives Johnson a blank check for the war. He can do whatever he wants, no need to ask Congress to formally declare war.
Wow. That's a lot of power for one guy, especially with things already so, intense.
And Johnson uses it big time.
Yeah.
U.S. troop deployments, they go through the roof. By 1968, over 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam.
Talk about escalating things quickly. It's like they get stuck in this cycle. Every move they make just drags them deeper into the mud.
And the human cost, it's impossible to measure, really. But it's not just Vietnam that's hurting. The war, it hits the U.S. hard, too. Economically, politically, the whole 9 yards.
It's not just a far-off war anymore, right? It's hitting home, impacting everyday Americans.
Big time. Late 1960s, that war is costing the U.S. a fortune, an absolute fortune. $2 billion a month.
$2 billion a month. That's insane. What does that even do to an economy?
It's not pretty. Inflation goes up. The U.S. is drowning in debt. And it's not just the money either. Remember Johnson talking about his great society, these big social programs meant to fight poverty, inequality, all that?
Right. Those were supposed to be like game changers, right? Did the war impact those at all?
They got gutted.
Yeah.
Money that could have gone to help people, it all went to the war. And that created this feeling of, I don't know, like a bait and switch,
Because here's Johnson talking about a great society while also, throwing everything into this increasingly unpopular war.
Exactly. And it's not just the spending, it's the lying. Johnson, he tries to keep people on board with the war, so he downplays how much it costs.
He lied to the American people.
Pretty much. He'd say the war cost about $800 million a month when it was really more than double that. People saw right through it, though. Created this huge credibility gap, the government saying one thing, reality being another.
Yeah, that's going to make people angry.
And this is all happening while everything else is going crazy too, right?
Yeah.
The civil rights movement, counterculture, people distrusting authority. It was a powder keg ready to blow.
And the war was like, the match that lit the fuse.
Exactly. And that's when the anti-war movement really takes off. On college campuses and churches, everywhere. Students, activists, religious leaders, even veterans, all saying, no more.
It's hard to imagine any war having that kind of impact today,
Yeah.
Bringing together so many different people who all just say, nope, this is wrong. What was it, do you think, that really got under people's skin, made that movement explode?
Oh, it was a perfect storm, really. The draft, for one.
Yeah.
Sending all these young guys, most of them barely old enough to shave, to fight in a war nobody understood.
And it wasn't equal, right?
Oh, hell no. The burden, it fell on the working class. Kids who couldn't dodge the draft like some rich kid with a doctor's note.
Classic example of, war always hits the have-nots harder.
Always. And then there's Tet, the Tet Offensive, 1968.
Yeah.
Militarily, yeah. U.S. and South Vietnam, they held their ground, but strategically,
Total disaster.
pretty much, it was like this wake-up call. North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, they launched these attacks all over South Vietnam cities, bases, everywhere. Nobody saw it coming, not like that.
Shattered the illusion, didn't it? That whole we're winning this thing narrative.
To pieces. The Tet Offensive showed that the communists, they could hit anywhere, anytime. And suddenly, Johnson's promises, they rang pretty hollow.
The gap between what they're saying and what's actually happening, it just gets wider and wider.
Yeah, and that just fueled the fire. People started to see this isn't just about fighting communism, it's about something else, something off.
And this is when the veterans, they really find their voice, right? The ones who'd been there, seen the reality firsthand.
Absolutely. Groups like Vietnam Veterans Against the War, these guys, they put their lives on the line and they came back saying, no more. This is wrong.
Powerful message. When the people sent to fight are the ones saying stop, people listen.
No doubt. And all this, it's happening during one hell of a year, 1968, election year. Johnson, his approval ratings in the toilet. Democratic Party's falling apart. He ends up dropping out, doesn't even run for re-election.
Wow.
Yeah. And Nixon sees an opening, peace with honor, he promises, and he wins. The war, it completely reshaped the political landscape.
It's amazing how much impact one conflict can have, not just on the battlefield, but back home, even on who ends up running the country.
And it doesn't end there. The war's legacy, it hangs over everything. Historians are still arguing about it, trying to make sense of it all.
You mentioned earlier there are a bunch of different schools of thought on the whole Vietnam thing. You want to break those down for us?
Sure. So you've got your Orthodox view. Historians like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., that crowd, they say, yeah, it was a tragedy, no doubt, but necessary. To stop communism, you got to draw a line in the sand. Vietnam was that line, even if it was messy.
So they're basically saying the U.S. was right to be there, even if it went sideways.
That's the gist of it. Then you've got the revisionists, guys like Gabriel Kolko. They come in saying, hold on, this wasn't just some noble fight against communism.
They think it was something else.
They say it was about power, U.S. imperialism, protecting their interests, their control, even if it meant propping up a corrupt regime.
So two completely different takes on the whole thing. You mentioned a third one too, post-revisionism. What's their take?
The post-revisionists, guys like John Lewis Gaddis, they try to find the middle ground. They say, yeah, the war was a failure for the U.S., no getting around that. But it wasn't just some evil plan either. They talk about miscalculations, misunderstandings on both sides.
So more nuanced than just good guys and bad guys.
Exactly. And then, after the Cold War ends, things shift again. You get this wave of post-Cold War historians. They bring a whole new perspective.
Like what do they see the others missed?
For one, they actually listen to the Vietnamese. Historians like Mark Lawrence, they argue that the U.S., they totally misread the situation. They saw communism, but it was really about nationalism. Vietnam wanting to be its own damn country, you know?
Which, looking back, seems pretty obvious.
Right. But the U.S. was so stuck in their Cold War mindset they couldn't see straight. And the post-Cold War historians, they really drive that point home. You got to listen to the people on the ground, not just the guys in suits making decisions from afar.
Man, history is messy.
Messier, the closer you look. But that's what makes it so fascinating, right? It's not about memorizing dates and names. It's about wrestling with these big questions, challenging what you think you know.
Speaking of big questions, what do you think? What's the lasting impact of the Vietnam War on the U.S.?
It's like it shook the country to its core, you know? The whole idea of America, the good guys, the invincible force for good, that took a serious hit. And the economy, forget about it. Inflation, debt, it took years to dig out from that hole.
And of course, there's the human cost. That's something you can't put a price tag on.
Over 58,000 American soldiers dead. And the Vietnamese, millions. Families torn apart, a whole generation scarred. It's a reminder that war, it doesn't just end when the guns go silent.
Heavy stuff. It really makes you think about the decisions leaders make, the ripple effects, how long those last.
No doubt. And for the U.S., it changes how they act in the world. Suddenly, they're not so quick to jump into every fight. Containment, that whole idea, it gets reevaluated.
It's amazing how much those early decisions, the ones we talked about, backing France, ignoring the Geneva Accords, it's like they set this whole thing in motion, like a chain reaction, impossible to stop.
It makes you wonder, what if they'd gone a different way back then? But that's history for you, right? A million what-ifs and no way to know for sure.
This deep dive has been, well, I learned a lot, that's for sure. From those early days in Vietnam, all the way to the protests back home, it's a wild ride.
And we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to uncover, so many different perspectives, so many stories still being told.
One thing that really stuck with me was how much those early decisions, backing France, not signing the Geneva Accords, it's like they set this whole chain of events in motion, like it became almost impossible to break free from that path. It really makes you think, what if different choices had been made?
It's a question historians are still debating, and it just highlights how important it is to understand the context, the motivations, how even well-intentioned actions can have these unintended and often tragic consequences.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just dates in a textbook. It's about understanding the present, even navigating the future. And for everyone listening, keep asking those questions, keep digging deeper. Until next time, keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.